Last week, we talked about making big saw cuts at the workbench and how it's kind of terrible. When you make big cuts at the standard workbench, your work holding is awkward. It's hard on your body, and you've got no power. The solution is a saw bench. These low benches used to be in every hand tool workshop. They get you on top of your work, where you can see your cut lines and use your biggest muscles to saw with power. If you try one of these, you'll never go back to sawing at the high workbench. Today, we're going to build a pair of traditional saw benches. We've got an English-style bench that's rock solid and has built-in storage, but we also have a Swedish-style bench that's lighter and easier to build. The plans have both designs at a low price, so you can build the one you like or build both. The seat of my English saw bench is just 2 pieces of construction 2x6. I don't want to waste time, so I'm just going to joint 2 edges and get those boards glued together. I made this a sprung joint, so it's hollow in the middle and touches on the ends. This way, one clamp squeezes the center shut and the tension in the joint keeps everything else together. After it's dry, I carefully flatten one face, gauge my thickness onto the opposite face, and plane down to my gauge lines. The whole build will go together smoother if you get your top really flat, so take an extra minute. Your legs can be made from a single 2x4, and you'll even have enough wood left over for some other parts. So measure twice and cut once. I'm going to prep my legs just as carefully as my top. I see old saw benches and saw horses all over the place, and they're usually falling apart because they were slapped together too quickly. I'm going to use my saw bench for years, so I'm going to make it like a piece of furniture. That means reference faces and edges, and all my surfaces planed smooth. One problem with a lot of saw bench designs is the legs stick out too far. So this is my lightweight traveler workbench, and it makes a good saw bench, but the legs stick out too far, and you can see a lot of damage on this front leg from where I've clipped it with the saw. My English saw bench has a nice wide stance, but the legs don't stick out. And we got this by starting narrow and then having the legs angled just a little bit. Now, angled legs can be tricky to build, but for this bench, all you have to do is make this batten here. When you attach your legs to it, you get the correct angle automatically. I'm using cheap white pine for my battens. This wide board is especially awkward to saw in the vise. I guess I really need a saw bench. These battens are going to hold the legs at the correct angle, so they need to be flat. The angles on those battens are really important, but they're also easy to get. You just measure the top and bottom and then saw down the sides. No angles, no protractor. Once you've got your first batten, trace it onto the second one. This way, they'll be identical for sure. The ends of your battens are going to be rough and full of splinters, so saw a little bit away from your lines and do the final trimming with a sharp plane. Then, ease those edges with a little chamfer. Now, you can use those battens to set a bevel and use the bevel to mark the tops of your legs. A quick trim and your legs will be flush with your battens. You can't see it in this shot, but I'm attaching my battens to my legs with screws and glue. The combination will keep the bench together for a long time. You'll need to drill pilot holes through your battens, but you can screw straight into your 2x4s, especially if you're using an impact driver. These ends are almost done, but there's nothing to screw the top into. You could use the ends of those 2x4s, but that's a weak connection, and it won't last. What we need is some side grain for the fasteners to grab. So here's the leftover stock from cutting the legs. I'm going to trace my angles right onto this piece, saw it, and then glue both pieces inside my battens. This is a face-to-face connection, so I don't need any screws and I've cut my angles precisely. The blocks wedge in place and I don't even need any clamps. When I was designing my English saw bench, I looked at pictures from dozens of old woodworking books, but my biggest inspiration came from a couple of photographs. This old saw bench is clearly in the English style, but it's built in a very simple way that anybody can do. I also like this bench because it is covered in saw cuts. Somebody used the heck out of it. And the best feature is that it's got battens and rails in the same plane, and that makes it really easy to add storage. My rails are these maple boards I got from an old bed frame. It's excellent timber and already rounded over on two edges. I saw my rails to length and shoot the ends to keep things neat. I'm going to half-lap these rails onto the legs, and you can see that I've laid out a long joint here. Too long, actually. Cutting such a deep joint was way too much work, so I made the joint shorter. It's just as good and much faster to cut. Installing the rails on my bench is easy, but this is hardwood, so clearance holes are essential. Once my rails are attached to my legs, the structure of the bench will be done. So you need to be careful to get the rails straight and make them square to the legs. When the rails are attached, your bench should sit pretty square on the floor. Now we can attach that top, and you can see why we put those blocks between the legs. They give us a nice side grain surface to screw into. The top is held on by 4 long screws. This allows for wood movement, and the top is easy to replace if it gets too beat up. The bench in the photo doesn't have a handhold, but I've been building Moravian stools all year long, and you can't beat the convenience of having that grip in the middle of the seat. I drill a few holes with a 1 1/2 inch spade bit and then just chisel out the waste between them. I'll finish off the top with a ripping notch. It's just a narrow triangle and it's easy to saw out. My finishing touch will be a storage shelf, and I'm going to use cheap, thin plywood to keep the weight down. This piece would be super awkward to saw at my workbench, but hey, I've got a saw bench, so the work is supported all along the cut, and I can easily shift around to make the long cut and the short cut fast and easy. Fitting the shelf is a little tricky, but not too bad. I lean the shelf in on one side and use a square to transfer my leg locations onto the material. After I cut some rectangles out of the corners, the shelf drops right into place, and I can screw it in from underneath. Now I can keep my favorite 2 hand saws right with my bench. It's really convenient. Your bench probably won't sit level, but you can put it up on your workbench, put shims under any short legs, and scribe with a pencil. Saw down your lines and your bench should be perfect. You want your bench to come right under your kneecap, but you should have plenty of length. I'm tall, so my legs only needed a little trim. My English saw bench is super sturdy and easy to build, but it's also kind of heavy and it uses a lot of material. I know some folks are going to want a lighter, simpler build. So I've also built a Swedish saw bench. It's probably not really Swedish, but it is lightweight and dead easy. And there are only 7 pieces of wood in the whole thing. Just like the English bench, the seat is just 2 pieces of 2x6, glued up and then planed flat. Leave it a bit long and then trim it to length. The only joints on this bench are these notches on the top. They hold the legs and give you the angles, so they're really important, but they're also not too hard. Measuring in from one end of the seat, we're going to make a mark on the top, then flip the ruler and make a second mark on the bottom. Connect these marks and you've got your angle. This is the only angle you need for the whole build, so set a bevel gauge to your line and lock it tight. Now you can use that bevel to lay out all of your notches. Just match the width of your legs and you're good. Set a gauge to the thickness of your leg and transfer that to the seat. We'll finish our layout with a square and then just remove the material in between our lines. I'm going for a tight fit, so I use a tenon saw and stay carefully on my lines. I also add a few relief cuts inside the joint, and that makes it easy to chip out the waste. I'm paring carefully down to my lines so the joint looks neat when it's done. I intentionally made all my joints a little bit too tight, so I can quickly fit them by planing a little material off the edge of my leg and then testing it. This will take a couple of tries, but you can sneak up on a perfect fit and it's not difficult. While the leg is in there, scribe it to the top of the seat and it will be easy to trim later. I've got 4 legs in place and I've temporarily screwed them to the seat so I can make the battens. The Swedish bench has a brilliantly simple design. These battens keep the legs at the correct distance from each other, hold them steady, and keep the bench from folding up when you put weight in the middle. Just like the other bench, my battens are pieces of white pine. You can use any wood. Even plywood is a good choice. The plans have measurements for the battens, but you should make sure they match the width of your legs. That's what really matters. For this design to really work, these battens have to tuck in really tight in the joint between the leg and the seat. There's a little angle in there, and we need to get that just right. Our bevel is already set at the correct angle, so we just need to mark that on the ends of the battens and plane down to those lines. The battens fit snugly under the seat, and I'm going to glue them in place and add a couple of clamps. Let the glue dry for 30 minutes, and we're on to the next step. Take the legs off the seat. Drill clearance holes through the battens, but be careful not to drill into your legs. Then you can add screws and run them in. While the legs are off the bench, you can trim the tops to those pencil marks we made earlier. All that careful work paid off, and I've got a nice tight fit for the leg assemblies. If you have to tap them in with a hammer, then you've done a great job. And if they're a little looser than this, it's not a big deal. I ended up adding a little bit of glue to these joints, and that made a huge difference. Let that glue dry for an hour, and your Swedish bench is ready to go. Since I built 2 benches in this video, you would expect me to say, I can't choose between them, they're equally good. But that's not true. I like the English bench way more. It's more stable, and I really use that built-in storage. But you might not want to get into a big build like this. You might want a quicker build that uses less wood. In that case, the Swedish bench is totally fine. It really works, and it's a quick, easy build. Now, no matter which one of these you make, you'll be able to work with boards up to about 8 or 10 feet long. If they get longer than that, you're going to need a second bench. Earlier this week, we were framing in some additions to the big part of the shop, and I had to cross-cut 12-foot 2x4s. And for that stuff, I really needed a second bench, so I was glad I had also built the Swedish. Start with the English, and then, when you're working with longer wood, build this one just to hold that long end. You'll be able to cut boards of any length. Of course, if you add a flat surface to your shop, you might be tempted to put a bunch of crap on it. So I've sized both of these saw benches to fit underneath my 2 most popular workbenches. If you've built either the original English joiner's bench or the minimum timber bench, either of my saw bench designs will slide right underneath. They won't take up any valuable floor space in your shop, and you won't be able to pile any junk on top of them. If you'd like to build either of these benches or both of them, you can get the plans. We've got both designs in a single, very affordable set of plans. We're always focused on affordability around here. Go to rexkrueger.com/store or click on the link down in the description. And last week, my patrons got these plans early and free. They get all of my plans for free, and a lot of other rewards. Go on over to patreon.com/rexkrueger and check out all the things we do for the people who make these videos possible. Whew! That was a big project. But we'll be back next week with something else. We hope you'll join us. Thanks for watching.